All right, so this is the lecture that we're going to be making up. It's covering the time of the latent terminal formative, so 300 BC to AD 300. And it's a very important 600-year period that we're going to be covering with quite a bit of discussion of sites during this time and how complex the societies are leading up to the Classic period, which I've talked about before. Classic period known for these large states, monumental architecture, monumental size. But the 600 years is really important to understand how these states emerged. So we're going to be taking a look at some of the key sites, some of the changes over time, and what it meant to live in a post-Olmec world. So now we're officially, in the time after the primary state of the Olmec emerged. So this marks an important transition. We have about 600 years of very complex chiefdoms, and eventually these chiefdoms in certain areas will consolidate power, centralize under one authority, and create a state. And so this is really, we still don't have states, but very quickly we will. Well, not very quickly. 600 years is a long period of time, which again reinforces this idea that, we talked about on last Friday, this diffusion theory, which tries to explain how secondary states come about. If it was as easy as diffusionist theorists make it sound, then we would have had states much sooner after the post-Olmec decline. But it takes 600 years of societal development and political change and environmental change and things like that to happen for these rulers to consolidate power. But when it happens, we see three major states emerge. And so we're going to talk about the foundations of those states today. We see change specifically first in the basin of Mexico, and then in the valley of Oaxaca. And we've talked about a couple of these sites already last time. We continue to see growth in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, even though the Olmec state has declined. That doesn't mean that they've totally abandoned the area. It's still a thriving area. Again, we need to keep in mind that, just because the state isn't there doesn't mean that it's devoid of population. A lot of times, just as in when, potentially a tribe-like society would go to a chiefdom and then maybe a couple hundred years later, convert back to smaller tribes. States and chiefdoms do the same thing. There's this cyclical nature between them. And so after the decline of the Olmec state, we just have a lot of powerful chiefdoms left. And eventually we see this manifest into a very powerful state or multiple states in southeastern Mesoamerica with the Mayan. So what we start to see are, and this really started with the Olmec, right? So, we see the spread of very distinct regional types of ceramics, iconography, and this tradition continues. This is how we're really seeing, where we're kind of culturally delineating these regions as being their own specific entity. The one thing that we see specifically at this time is the spread of ceramics, that certain regions have very similar types and styles. And so one can attribute that to being part of a culture where these styles are sought after. They represent some kind of meaning, and there's demand on the market for them. So what Evans defines these as are pottery style zones. And these are areas where particular combinations of whether it's types of clay or vessel form or surface decoration or the different paints that are used create very distinctive and localized types. These are two that we have at this time, actually. So the one on the right we've talked about before. This is coming from the Oaxaca Highlands, and this is its own regional type. It's Oaxaca grayware. It is at one time very plain, but at another time it's very beautiful in its simplicity and is very intricate in its design as far as the anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines that we see. So it doesn't have the paint or decoration, so to speak. Well, I shouldn't say decoration. It does have decoration, but the painting style is very different, as opposed to that on the left, which is called Chapiquero, which is coming from western Mexico. A very, very popular terminal formative and early or pre-classic style. So we're starting to see regions, when we're doing archaeology during this time, um, typically the shared ceramic styles are a good indication that that specific area is part of a larger, very complex socio-economic polity. The other thing that we see emerge, so similarities that are emerging through these regions, is the emergence of the solar calendar and a 260-day calendar, which the solar calendar specifically marks the seasonal cultivation cycle, and the 260-day calendar tends to be more of a ritual calendar. So we start seeing, and we're going to be talking about this in a lecture. We're going to be talking about the calendric systems, the writing systems, the counting systems. And so we start seeing all of these things emerge during this time. Um, and it is thought that the Olmec might have had a very um, early version towards the end of their state, an early version of this, what's now considered the Mayan glyph system. And so we see this emerge especially out of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, early development of writing and record keeping, and the use of counting systems. This is one sketch of the very, very early stela that was found. And this was found, I believe, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This was embedded in a river and was removed. Some of it was incomplete, the other parts were just eroded from the river. But this is early kind of pre-Maya glyph writing. And we can decode some of it because there are some similarities to what we know as the Mayan glyph system, but some of it is too early and we just don't have a cipher for it. We also see this is one of the other major things that is happening that is, you know, really allowing these complex chiefdoms to emerge is rising populations. We're starting to see urbanization of settlements around a major central location with an emphasis on monumental architecture and civic ceremonial architecture. So there is inherently this, and this is really, I mean, part of this had been started before the Olmec, but the Olmec had really, instituted this as a formally planned center area. And we see throughout Mesoamerica at this time other types of urban development occurring. Now, still not quite on the scale of what we had at La Venta or what we will have, like at Teotihuacan and Monte Alban. But regardless, this is still, we're talking very large, complex chiefdoms. And of course, anytime you see rising populations and complex urban and settlement development, you see this very wealthy, powerful class of elite rulers. This is now an institution, and you're going to hear me use that word quite a bit from here on out because this isn't a fluke thing. So this is the ruling class is an institution. Power has now been handed down through these social classes for going on probably at least 500 or 600 years. So this has been embedded in society. The social class and social ranking is now a thing, and there isn't really an easy way to revert back to that. And so, more and more people generationally are being born into a commoner class or being born into, a higher middle class or elite class. And there are circumstances, and we'll talk about some of these throughout the semester, where we see in some societies there is the potential for upward social mobility. But it's an institution. It's hard to break into that elite class. And so we see this, we see more social complexity emerge. So these are the four things that we're seeing regionally. So regardless of whether it's the basin of Mexico or the Valley of Oaxaca or in the southern Yucatan, all of these things are occurring in all of these regions, which are helping to give rise to these complex chiefdoms and eventually will give way to these large states. So now let's take a look at each of these regions and kind of dissect what's going on there. The first one we'll take a look at is the Basin of Mexico. We have four specific areas of development. I guess the key things to focus in on here are the sites. We're going to be talking about a couple of key sites, and you'll have to know a couple of major aspects of each of these sites. So feel free to pause and go back in the lecture because each of these will come up on the exam to some extent. So we've talked about Cuicuilco as the major center in the area. If you look on both maps, actually, you can see it in the southwestern portion of Lake Texcoco. If you look at a current map, just to give you some geographical provenience here, you're not going to see Lake Texcoco because Lake Texcoco no longer exists. That is now the area of Mexico City. It was drained, partially modified by the Aztec, but pretty much drained by the Spanish. And there still exists a city on a now drained lake bed. But at the time, especially the southern end of the lake basin, you can imagine how fertile this area was when you combine the volcanic soil and the lacustrine meaning like lake resources. The southern end especially was very, very good for agriculture. And so we have quite a bit of population growth at Cuicuilco. Teotihuacan was still kind of one of those more fringe settlements. It didn't nearly have the numbers that Cuicuilco had because it was in a more arid northern area, kind of further away from the lake shore. And luckily, there was irrigation developed in Teotihuacan so that they could um, utilize that agricultural land because that used to be marginal land. You probably, maybe could get a decent harvest once per year, but with the onset of canal irrigation, that really did help out Teotihuacan. So again, here's an image of Cuicuilco. Southern end of the basin had the basin's first monumental architecture. This round pyramid is a really good example of that. So it was the basin's fastest growing chiefdom, and it had about 20,000 people. So we're talking right on the cusp of being a state. Very, very large chiefdom here. A lot of rainfall in this area, which led to intensive agriculture, and was also a center for trade. Being on the southern edge of the lake, it was very well suited to be near good trade routes into the lowlands and into Oaxaca. So very, very important area. Likewise on Teotihuacan, being on the northeastern side, more arid, more marginal area, like I said. Water was more scarce, but they did develop canal irrigation, which did help population growth. So by the time we hit, about 100 BC, Teotihuacan is starting to grow in size. I would say it's probably in the maybe the second largest site in the lake basin, but Cuicuilco had it by quite a bit. Cuicuilco is by far the largest within the area. Now, by the end of the late formative and the start of the terminal formative, there was a volcanic eruption. And this volcanic eruption occurred in the southern portion of the lake, and it decimated the southern end of the basin. And it forced the population to flee, and they went to the next largest settlement, which was Teotihuacan. And so, just because of this, well, I mean, not just because of this, but I mean, this large environmental shift and this geologic activity was a primary contributing factor to why the population went to Teotihuacan. And luckily, Teotihuacan had the resources to allow for this influx of people. They had canal irrigation, so they could increase the carrying capacity and really provide. And of course, the elites were probably thrilled because with this large population, you increase your labor pool. And I mean, you can see it's not just Huiquilco, it's the majority of the southern lake basin if you look at the side by side comparison. So on the left, we have the basin of Mexico from 300 to 100 BC. And then from 100 BC to 100 AD, Teotihuacan by far becomes the dominant center. And a lot of it, owing to that volcanic eruption. So this is where we're at, right around the 0 to 100 AD, and this will really propel Teotihuacan forward into statehood. We're not quite there yet. We're going to get to it after the first exam, but this is, when we talk about the emergence of states and the events that led to this, well, this large change and the migration of people because of this natural event is one large contributing factor as to why Teotihuacan became the size it did very quickly. So that's what's going on in the basin of Mexico. Now we have the Valley of Oaxaca. If you remember the Valley of Oaxaca, that was when we talked about the archaeological evidence for warfare. We talked about San Jose Magote, which occurred, that's in the kind of the northwestern arm of the valley. That was really the largest chiefdom. And so we see this warfare that's rampant throughout the whole of the Valley of Oaxaca. And warfare had been recorded at San Jose Magote. These chiefdoms are extremely competitive, going after resources, going after agricultural land and the valley floors. And so this is really one of the main driving factors as to why a state emerges here, is this conflict for resources. So if you go back to last week, we talked about all the many different potential aspects of why states emerge. Well, we see different examples, right? So, I mean, again, going back to this concept of diffusion, every state we see emerge from this period emerges in such a different manner. And so it's hard to rely on the basic outward ripples of diffusionist theory to explain why states emerge. In Monte Alban, it's this conflict. This conflict causes populations to centralize at these major settlements because the one thing these chiefdoms do is that these large chiefdoms, that these large settlements offer protection. And so, you don't want to be a small village living in the middle of the valley, potentially being caught between large armed warfare between these, pretty complex militaries. And so they would naturally flee to these hilltop settlements that were defended. So this helps centralize the population, and that's a plus for the elites because it adds population to their centers. They get a larger labor pool. They get people to work on their large-scale monumental architecture. So that's one of the major reasons that we see. And so what we end up seeing is at a very specific time, San Jose Magote is basically overrun, is beaten in a large conflict. And sorry, that's kind of cut off, but that says Monte Alban is now the major center in the area, and you can see it. It's centrally located. So before, each of these three arms were kind of ruled by a larger chiefdom that would, have conflicts back and forth. But what happens is we see one large-scale conflict occur, and all of a sudden, where there wasn't a site, Monte Alban pops up, and it is centrally located. It is now officially the largest site in the area. And so this is now Monte Alban is Not nearly as big as Quiquilco, actually. 5,000 people, so still a complex chiefdom, primarily defensive. They haven't totally united the valley. They are the largest chiefdom in the area and dominate a good portion of it, but much more focused on warfare, less monumental architecture. They haven't totally united, or I should say, conquered the entire valley of Oaxaca yet. Um, so the first phase, 5,000 people, you can tell they're still very much centered on this military conflict. The second phase, Monte Alban, goes to 20,000. So within a shorter period of time, I would say maybe 100 to 200 years, Monte Alban succeeds at conquering the valley, is now considered a true urban center, a city, and this was the first confederation of chiefdoms under the rule of the elites at Monte Alban. Monte Alban is now the capital, and this transforms into a dynasty of this state, unifies the valley into one culture. Now, this is where it gets a little hazy because I'll have to get my dates. Once we talk about Monte Alban, we'll talk about the dating of how all of this happens, and I'm not going to have you memorize the dates, but there is some conflict within archaeological circles because some say that this is actually Mesoamerica's first true state. Um, However, I think most people out there will agree that the Olmecs were, um, but the Zapotecs will emerge shortly thereafter, and so uh, we see this emerge probably around 100 A.D., maybe a little bit before. And so these are some of the sites. This is one of the images of the kind of the carvings, the relief carvings, and then of course the site of Monte Alban in the highlands of Oaxaca. Elsewhere, in the highlands near the basin and north of Oaxaca, we see the development of other cultures. We have Chupiquero. Um, this is a culture defined primarily by its pottery style. This is a style that spreads through regions and is copied very heavily. We see Chupiquero show up in Oaxaca. We see Chupiquero showing up in Teotihuacan. It's one of the most highly sought after um, types of pottery, especially on the black market. If you go to the D. Young Museum, you're going to see excellent examples of Chupiquero. It's known for their red on buff styles, similar to this, very geometric designs, um, stepped design. It's a lot of black, a lot of cream and white colors. You do see some blue and some yellow as well, but this is just it's an amazing ceramic culture that emerges. Starts in western Mexico, spreads into the basin. This is also one of the first cultures where we have cemetery sites as well. The major site of the Chupiquero culture is at a site called Tuchitlan, and they're very distinct. Typically, that's the case with cultures in West Mexico, is that they're a little bit different than elsewhere, especially when you compare them to the basin of Mexico. So it's defined by these, of course, the ceramics, which are very distinct. They had these circular stepped pyramids, which are very beautiful, and they had shaft tombs. So there were these tombs that had like a 45-degree shaft dug down into the earth, and then they would have a tomb burial, which you typically don't see the shaft tombs anywhere else. So that's something we're just seeing in West Mexico. And then we see hollow figurines that were used as grave goods. Again, if you go to D. Young, you'll see these hollow figurines, very iconic types of figurines. There's another example of some Chupiquero pottery, and there is an image of the figurines. Again, mimicking the geometric designs, the colors, the slip, all of that of the ceramics. But these are hollow figurines, and some of them are very large, actually. I've seen some that are about 2 feet tall. And then this is the site of Tuchitlan and their pyramids. They're not hollow; they're filled. Actually, some of them do have shaft tombs dug into them, but for the most part, they're not hollow like some of the other pyramids that we'll talk about. Some of the Mayan pyramids are hollow or somewhat hollow. In that they have like antechambers and stuff like that. This is a ton of earth moving, as well as using stones. So these are very distinct types of architecture, ceramics, and burial traditions in West Mexico. Now, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, this area comprises the most direct descendants of the Olmec. After the decline of the Olmec state, we again see very complex chiefdoms emerge here. Many of these sites are considered major, but they're not. They're nothing like those. They're not as large or dominant as those in the Valley of Oaxaca, like Monte Alban, or the Basin of Mexico, like Teotihuacan and Cuicuilco. These are some of the major sites: Tres Zapotes, Laguna Sope, Chiapa de Corzo, and Izapa. They're now, instead of being kind of on the further northern side where the Olmec heartland was, they're located further on the southern side. Of these, we're going to talk about Izapa because that's probably the most indicative of what we will see for an early Maya style site. So it consisted of a major ceremonial center, as depicted here. You can again see the plaza with the larger pyramid at the end, flanked by the civic ceremonial center. So, that architectural planning of La Venta lives on in this area. Very famous for the artistic styles coming out of here. There are over 250 stone sculptures in this area. Again, something that the Olmec were very much known for, their stone carving, and something that the Maya will also be known for. So, when you look at the iconography of these styles, you look at some of this relief carving, and this displays features of both past Olmec art as well as the beginnings of Maya art. So it's this really neat kind of intermediate phase between the decline of the Olmec and the rise of the Maya. So this Izapa is a great site where we see the hybridization of these artistic styles. Because of course, I mean, these are the descendants of the Olmec, but these will be the ancestors of the Maya as well. So naturally we see some overlap in some of their artistic styles. We also have the existence of the first evidence of glyph writing and the long count calendar. So again, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec still is one of the areas where we see firsts occur. We have the first state emerge there with the Olmec, and now we're having this what I refer to as the beginnings of a long-standing intellectual tradition that really is taken up by the Maya with their um, their amazing written language and their carving and their art and the counting system and the calendrical system. It really starts at sites like Izapa. And again, it's these areas in the lowlands that benefit from that trade network that was set up by their Olmec ancestors. And they continue to trade into the highlands. And these elites are getting very wealthy because of this. The elites are, controlling the acquisition, the production, and the trade of these, what we call preciosities, precious goods, from the lowland into the highland. And these include things like cacao, feathers, such as the quetzal feather, but as well as other types of feathers, and feline skins. And we see feline skins being worn in the iconography for this is um, ritual wear and outfits that were worn during the elites. So So they're really cornering the market on a lot of these precious goods and exotic items, and getting pretty wealthy because of it. All right, in southwestern Mesoamerica, this is our last region that we're going to be talking about, split into two geographical areas, the highlands and the lowlands. Um, and so what we will have, so first, some of our major sites are coming from the highlands. Um, Caminal Huyu, you can see in the lower area there, um, a major site, expands very quickly in population, and located close to major obsidian sources, which is a kind of a rarity in the Maya region, or what will become the Maya region. Excuse me, we're not quite there yet. Um, but what we have at Caminal Huyu is these local elites are controlling the obsidian trade because the further north you get, and I don't know if you can remember back to our Mesoamerican ecology lecture, but you notice that there is a divide on the Pacific side of the isthmus and into the Yucatan. Um, there is some mountainous areas, but the further north you go, the more flat the topography gets, and you get away from obsidian and basalt, and you get towards just straight limestone bedrock. And so this really gives them a unique position in this area, and they're starting to control the production and trade of obsidian. They also had intensive agriculture and irrigation techniques, which again aided their population growth and allowed them to, be very successful in growing these types of agriculture. Very influential monumental architecture and sculpture. Again, a site that is and if on this net we'll show you. Oops, sorry. Let me go back to that. Sorry about that. I wanted to show you an image. We'll see it on the next slide. Um, sorry about that. This is not, it's acting up. Okay, let's see if we can get through this. Influential types of art that will lead to a very distinct style that is coming out of the Maya region, or what will be the Maya region. This artistic style is being adopted by other cultures, and key iconography is related to ritual. So we see the correlation again between the elite and ritual and the art style. So this is something that will become very prevalent going forward. All right, now on to this next image. This is Caminal Huyu, quite a bit of it, not yet excavated, but we do see on the top we see the unexcavated portion, but these mounds are part of the site that have architecture associated with it. We do see this larger steep stepped pyramid that has been uncovered and partially reconstructed. And then, of course, we see this art style, this relief carving of this monument, and that is very, very indicative of what we will see in about 200 years with Mayan sites. So, similar to Izapa, Caminal Huyu is showing early signs of the Maya cultural traditions and art traditions and architecture traditions. And into the Maya lowlands. Um, Nakbe is a major site, and you can see the image of it right there. So further north into the lowlands consisted of high, consistent population throughout. The lowlands, and this gets back to what we talked about with agriculture. In the Valley of Oaxaca and in the Basin of Mexico, it's much easier for population to centralize because the agriculture is so huge. I mean, they can do it year round. They have canal irrigation. They have terracing. It is easy to increase the, well, I won't say easy, but it's much easier to increase the carrying capacity in the highlands, given how prevalent and how prolific the agriculture is there. When you compare it to the lowlands, they're still they do have irrigation, but they're still working with a relatively shallow type of topsoil. It's not as fertile, and it's just, I mean, environmentally, it's not as well suited for agriculture as the highlands, and because of that, even though we have higher populations, it's not dense populations. It's more spread out. And so what you see are these smaller centers pop up everywhere. These are competing chiefdoms all throughout the lowlands. Nakbe is one of them. And they're temple pyramids. They are similar. They're very steep. They're stepped pyramids. They will get very tall. But I want you to remember this because going forward, this is going to make sense when we start talking about the Maya states in this region. Um, because we never have one dominate. And this is due to, in part, the the population and the population's, um, uh, I guess you could say, how they react to the environment. Because there is no large agricultural center, it's much harder for the land to have a high carrying capacity. Therefore, populations had to be more spread out. And because of that, instead of one large major center emerge, like La Venta, or like Monte Alban, or like Teotihuacan, you have smaller but very powerful and important centers pop up all over the landscape. And Nakbe, this is really where we start seeing the foundations of, again, similar to Izapa, similar to Kaminalhuyu, we see the origins of the Mayan style here. We see specifically architecture, stepped temple pyramids covered with plaster. Even though this image you don't see that, well, you can kind of see the plaster in some areas. The plaster is created from limestone. It's ground limestone mixed with kind of um, like water or something, like to create a paste. And every time I show you an image of these monuments, especially when we get to the Maya sites, all you're seeing is the interior. You're seeing kind of the substructure of these monuments. These temple monuments would have been plastered with white limestone plaster and then painted with red ochre or Maya blue, and they would have just shone on the landscape. And so we start seeing these architectural styles emerge at sites like Nakbe. Plastered, steep temple pyramids. This type of construction style is very indicative of this area. Apron moldings, and finally the E group. And I'm going to show you an image of the E group here. I'm going to come back to this because it's a little bit harder to explain. But basically, the E group is kind of a take on what La Venta was doing. But instead of the larger temple being located to the north, instead there's, well, it might still be located to the north, but it's a different kind of a plan. You still have a plaza in the middle, but it's more of this kind of rectangular side, kind of horizontal layout. And so the idea is that if you were to look at that middle group, the west group, that major pyramid in the middle, it looks like a capital E. And the E group is something that this type of architectural and urban planning that Maya sites going forward are just kind of known for. So that is all I have for you. So we went over the major regional similarities that we see: urbanization, rising populations, the institutional nature of the elite class, and then we talked about what's going on in each of these regions, from the Valley of Oaxaca to the basin of Mexico, to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and finally in the lowlands, in the lowlands and the highlands in southeastern Yucatan. Go through this lecture. Um, Feel free to rewind, go through it again, whatever you need to do. Make sure that you're prepared, and I will answer any questions that you have. If parts of it were kind of fuzzy or I went a little bit too fast, let me know, and I'll take 5 or 10 minutes before class next time to go back over this. All right, thank you.